We are now starting out live on YouTube and Google Chat. I want to welcome everybody to our very important discussion about our public lands. I'm Representative Jared Polis. We'll be beginning the discussion in 2 or 3 minutes. And I just want to thank all of you who have joined us. There will be the opportunity to ask questions of myself and our excellent panelists that we have today. Simply type them in the live chat window, and we will get to them after a few questions that I have to start us off today. Myself and the panelists, we will be with you for an hour. We have a lot of important issues to talk about because there's a lot going on with our public lands. And as those of us who live in Colorado know, not only are our public lands an important part of our quality of life, but they're also a critical economic driver for our region and our state, creating many of the jobs that we rely upon, as well as in contributing to our environment and the quality of life. There's been a constant assault on our public lands, beginning in the House Rules package itself, which stated that public lands have no value, not only something that's offensive for those of us who come from areas with public lands, but frankly, that was a backdoor effort to make it easier to sell off public lands. Because if they have zero value, it can be done through a simpler legislative process because of the lack of a budgetary cost to doing so. It wouldn't be subject to having to pay for. I'm Jared Polis. I want to welcome our over 30 people who joined us so far, with more logging on every minute. I'm going to begin by doing a brief introduction of our fine panelists, and then we'll get to some of our questions. Throughout my time in Congress, I've made it a major focus to protect our public lands. And that's why I've introduced legislation called the Continental Divide Wilderness and Recreation Act, which would protect upwards of 70,000 acres in Eagle and Summit County. I've worked to increase funding for the protection and stewardship of our public lands, including public lands law enforcement or fighting forest fires. And like you, who are joining us today, I'm very excited to hear from our panelists some of the work they're doing and why they share our passions about protecting our public land. So our panelists are, and when I introduce you, the way that people are seeing this is they see a little icon on the bottom with your face. So if you could just raise your hand like this and wave when I introduce you, that'll help all of our people who are here know who you are. I want to begin by introducing Scott Braden. Scott is a public lands and wilderness advocate, works for Conservation Colorado. He brings over a decade of experience in advocacy. And he fell in love with wild places working for Outward Bound, and he's somebody who I've had the opportunity to work with on our Continental Divide Wilderness and Recreation package. Anders Reynolds, raise your hand. He used to work on Capitol Hill for one of our Democrats we used to have from Arkansas. He ran congressional campaigns down there. He's with the Delta Regional Authority. His current capacity is an officer of public lands at the Pew Charitable Trust, which does a lot of important objective and data-driven work around the importance of our public lands. Scott Miller is the Senior Regional Director for the Southwest region, which is Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. And Scott is focused on federal public land, natural resources, water, and much more during his career, including forest restoration and wilderness protection. Thanks, Scott Miller. So there's two Scotts who joined us, Scott Braden and Scott Miller, for those who caught that. So I'm going to make sure to use both of their names as we go to them. Hi, I'm Jared Polis. I want to welcome everybody to our call. We're just going through the introductions of our wonderful panelists here today, and we'll jump right into it. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the live chat. We have a few that we'll be starting off with in a moment. Next, I want to introduce Jim Alexie. Jim is the Colorado Chapter Director for Sierra Club. Aside from a brief break to attend business school, Jim spent the past 18 years working on behalf of progressive and conservation causes. His work has taken him across 7 states, spanning the public sector side, the startup side, and the nonprofit side. Welcome, Jim. And finally, Alex Boyan, who I've known personally for many years. Alex is the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Outdoor Industry Association. He joined the Outdoor Industry Association in 2004. He's worked on recreation and public lands policies, and he leads a staff of 5 in the Outdoor Industry Association's offices in Boulder, Colorado, and Washington. Like so many of us, Alex is also an outdoor recreationalist, enjoying hiking, camping, climbing, and other activities. Before we begin, Anders, I want to express our hope that Marnie's feeling better. We had invited her to attend. We're grateful that she arranged for you to replace her on such short notice, and please convey to her that we hope she recovers from her difficulties shortly. So first of all, and welcome everybody. There's a live chat, which I'm going to say hello in, just so you see it over there. And if you have any questions, you can put them there. I'm going to just start briefly by talking about what are our public lands? What are we even talking about here today? And really, truly, our public lands are one of our nation's and our state's greatest treasures, because every American has a personal stake in how these places are cared for. We're talking about lands that fall into many different legal categories: national forests, BLM lands, which are administered from a different agency rather than Department of Agriculture, wildlife preserves, wilderness, wild and scenic rivers, national parks, iconic, including Rocky Mountain National Park with millions of visitors a year. So these are all our federal lands. The district that I have the opportunity to represent, the 2nd Congressional District of Colorado, is 65% federal land. So it's actually a majority of the territory that I represent is federal land. Scott Miller, I want you to talk about what is wilderness, one of the classifications of public land that gives ongoing and enduring protection. What's the idea behind wilderness, and how can we work to protect more lands through wilderness level federal protections?
Thanks, Representative Polis. So wilderness is just one designation of national public lands, as you said, and it's the most protective of all the designations. And the purpose of wilderness is really to focus on protecting and managing federal lands to preserve its natural conditions. And so it's land that is unmanaged from a natural condition standpoint, and it's undeveloped and untrammeled. It also is land that has great recreational characteristics. So you can hike and camp and hunt and fish and horseback ride in wilderness, but the point of it is really to protect the natural conditions. And so there are about 765 areas across the United States that are designated only by Congress as wilderness. And there's more on the way. One of our newest wilderness areas in the country is the Hermosa Creek Wilderness Area in southwest Colorado. There, in the last Congress, was more wilderness designated in Idaho. And as you said, Representative Polis, we're working on another 40,000 acres about in Summit and eastern Eagle counties as part of the Continental Divide and Wilderness Recreation Act that you're championing.
Thank you. And I think, it's important to point out the difference between protections in a travel management plan or an executive order and a permanent statutory protection. Once Congress puts it into law, it requires a complete change of that law, which is very difficult to do, to ever alter that protection. That's why we see wilderness as the most permanent and enduring form of protection, because it actually takes an act of Congress, the House, the Senate, and the President all agreeing to make it the law of the land. Scott Braden, in what ways has Colorado in our state been a leader in protecting our public lands, and what problems do we face in both our state and nationally with regard to maintaining our Western and American heritage as reflected in our public lands?
Yeah, well, Colorado has been a tremendous leader on public lands protection. Colorado has about 24 million acres of national public lands, and of that, we've been able to protect 43 acres as wilderness. Like Scott Miller mentioned, Hermosa Creek was the latest edition of that, and we're certainly looking to add more, such as the Continental Divide bill. But we've been able to protect about 3.5 million acres at this highest level of protection. But we've also been able to protect a lot of other places. We've got about 500,000 acres of BLM lands that are protected as wilderness study areas. We have about 4.5 million acres of Forest Service roadless areas. And then it's important to also at the state level think that, through Great Outdoors Colorado and money generated from our state's lottery, we've been able to create a whole lot of both recreational infrastructure in the form of parks and trails, but we've also been able to protect and acquire, lands that can become public lands that are very important to our state. And lastly, I think I'll just mention that we've seen attempts across the West, both at state legislatures and in Congress, to this notion of transferring federal public lands to state or private hands. And I'm proud to say that while we've certainly seen attempts at that in the Colorado state legislature, we've been able to beat those back every single time. And in fact, Colorado last year was able to pass the first in nation Colorado Public Lands Day. It's the first state-based holiday that is a recognition of the importance of these public lands to all of us. So I think we have a lot to be proud of in Colorado, Congressman.
What a great idea, Scott. And we're having a lot of questions lining up already. Put them in the live chat. We'll get to them shortly. Once again, I'm Jared Polis. I want to welcome you to our discussion about public lands and conservation. The next question that I want to direct to Jim, and maybe Scott wants to weigh in, is about fracking and oil and gas drilling and extraction activities. It's frankly something that I hear about a lot, representing northern Colorado. I wanted to talk briefly about extraction activities on federal land. How can we make sure that they're done in a way that's environmentally friendly, not done in ecologically sensitive areas? What are some of the tools that we have and should be using and are trying to use to protect our public lands from extraction activities? Jim?
Yeah, that's a great and challenging question, Congressman. The first thing is I think citizens and all of us can demand good stewardship of our public lands, and that means working with the Bureau of Land Management and working with the Forest Service and asking them to protect our treasured places. Beyond that, there are other things that can be done. Obviously, Congress can pass legislation to stop fracking. The president obviously has the ability to use the Antiquities Act to protect public lands from oil and gas development. But in short, it's to really restrict oil and gas development on public lands. It's really a death by 1,000 cuts. It takes a lot of work based on current conditions. Beyond that, to make it safer, one of the things that we can do is we can continue to push for smart, common sense things like methane emission capture. The Bureau of Land Management, as folks may know, passed some really smart methane capture rules, and doing things like that actually make oil and gas development safer.
And I'll just jump in on that to say that, the methane rule that is at the national level is being currently threatened by Congress, by the US Senate at the moment, actually, is based on a Colorado rule. So Colorado has been a leader on methane waste capture and making sure that, we are minimizing the amount of harmful greenhouse gases that are, coming off of the oil and gas development. And so that's why it's so critical, methane doesn't respect the state line, and that's why this national rule is so important, not just from the debate of where fracking occurs and how that happens, which is truly important, but also the climate implications, which are also critically important.
Thank you. We have a bunch of new viewers. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Jared Polis. We have one or two more questions for our panelists, and then we open it up to you. There's a number of questions being displayed in the live chat. We're going to get those directed to our panelists in a few minutes. I wanted to ask Anders, and maybe Alex wants to comment as well. I get asked this a lot. Why does it matter who owns the land? Why shouldn't federal lands be transferred to states like Colorado? Why would people or groups, what's their real agenda if they're trying to transfer those lands to the states? Maybe give a little bit of the backdrop of what's actually being discussed, because it's a little bit confusing when people are talking about, well, they're both the government. Why does it matter who owns it?
Sure. Well, first of all, it matters because it's your land and you own it. You should think of America's public lands like a real estate trust in which you, along with every other American citizen, receives and owns a single share as your birthright. I don't feel totally comfortable speculating as to why other people or groups would want to transfer our land to state ownership. But what I can say is that states have traditionally not done a very good job of keeping public lands in public hands. When the Western states became states, they were granted millions of acres of lands by the federal government. Utah has sold off over 50% of these lands. Idaho sold off 41%. Oregon has sold 77%. Nevada has sold off all but 0.1% of the 2.7 million acres it received as statehood. Second, it matters because the standards for how these lands are managed is different, like you mentioned. Federal land management laws require agencies to manage our lands according to the principles of multiple use, that is, balancing extractive uses like timber harvest or mining with the needs of fish, wildlife, recreation, environmental quality, and much more. and also by the principle of sustained yield. So taking the long view and making sure that those uses will be around in perpetuity. Those management principles don't apply to land owned by the states. Third, it matters because access matters. State-owned lands are often held in trust, but are not open to the public for their use and enjoyment. For instance, only 20% of state trust lands in Colorado are currently open to the public for hunting and fishing. And finally, it matters because managing these lands costs money. Those states that have taken a hard look at the cost of managing public lands, like Wyoming, which just published a report on this topic last fall, have determined that transferring public lands into state ownership is not a good deal financially for the state, because it would suddenly have to pay to police those lands, fight fires on them, etc. So a lot of people have expressed concerns that states would have to choose between raising taxes or selling off those lands to private interests in order to reduce management costs.
And just 2 points on that before we move on to Alex, and if he wants to opine on this one or the next question. We have a federal program called PILT, which is payment in lieu of taxes. What a lot of people don't realize is federal lands located in counties are non-taxable. So a lot of our counties that have a lot of public lands don't receive any revenue from that. Presumably, and one of the reasons that many local governments are skeptical is if those were turned over to the state, there would no longer be a federal program to help make those counties whole. It would be an additional burden on the state, which wouldn't have the resources. I'd also like to point out there's been perhaps what I would call a deliberate effort to underinvest in the stewardship of our federal public lands and try to use that as an argument that the federal government isn't good at maintaining them, when in fact many of the people making that very argument have been the same people that have underinvested in the stewardship of it, stretched our ranger resources even thinner than they should be for proper stewardship of our public lands. Alex, I wanted you to address A, why it matters who owns the public lands, but B, what's the economic benefit to protecting those public lands? And in your experience, how does protecting those lands benefit businesses and communities? You represent many businesses. What's the benefit to those businesses and jobs in having those public lands and keeping them public?
Sure. Well, I'll give a little bit of background on what Outdoor Industry Association is and kind of go into the narrative about our recreation economy report. But Outdoor Industry Association is the national trade association for suppliers, manufacturers, and retailers of outdoor recreation products. So everybody who basically makes, or we represent them in Washington, D.C. and in state houses across the country. Our report, the OIA Outdoor Recreation Economy Report, showed in 2012 that outdoor recreation contributes $646 billion every year to the U.S. economy. It supports 6.1 American jobs, and we also have a state-by-state report on our website at outdoorindustry.org. For example, in Colorado, outdoor recreation is a $13.2 billion industry, adding 125,000 jobs here in Colorado. OIA is about to put out a new economic report that actually will get into the congressional district level. So by the end of the year, we will be able to show, Colorado, the second congressional district, as compared to other congressional districts, what those recreation economies are. And I find that particularly interesting, as you said, Congressman, at the very beginning, that the second congressional district is about 65% public lands compared to Utah's 67% public lands. And I think this district, the second district, has really done a phenomenal job. You've done a phenomenal job of really supporting the recreation economy in the district, but show balanced land use, which is what we do. Of course, there has to be all kinds of development and uses of the land. But what we show is that this outdoor recreation economy really does depend on America's public lands to drive that recreation economy. So we think of it and talk about it in a way that public lands and waters are an infrastructure in the same way that the telecommunications industry has fiber optics or a satellite network, or the automobile industry depends on the interstate highway system as their infrastructure. The outdoor recreation industry and the outdoor recreation economy really does depend on public lands and waters as that infrastructure. So who owns the public lands? It is, to Anders' point, we'd really echo that it is part of our American heritage since the very beginning of the nation, that kind of the right to roam and to be and see this wonderful landscape that we are privileged enough to live in has continued throughout American history. Obviously, Theodore Roosevelt is one of the most iconic champions of this idea, and it has continued up even through recent presidents with President Reagan, George W. Bush, and then President Obama. And so we're really watching this administration closely and seeing what they plan to do. So far, we've heard from Secretary Zinke at Interior that he has no intention of pursuing state takeover. But with what we've seen so far, we really are watching that closely because, as I said, and as Honors kind of alluded to, these national public lands are our right as Americans. We share them, we jointly own them, and to turn them over to states that may or may not manage them for for access and management of those public lands, if states may have to sell them off if their budgets are
Thank you. I want to get to a few questions now that people have. Josh asked, what type of actions can I do as a citizen to protect our public lands? And Joe asked, are there current bills in the House or the Colorado Assembly that are threatening to our public lands? I'd like to pose to our panelists, and maybe Scott or Jim, what opportunities are there for the public to be involved to protect our public lands?
Thanks, Congressman. You know, public lands work best when they have a constituency of people who care about them. I mean, it's critical. This is why it's so important to get young people involved in the outdoors, and why it's so important that the public remain educated on the kinds of issues that public lands present. As far as ways to get involved and ways to influence their management, on the local and the state level, just starting super local, parks are public lands, parks are in open spaces. It matters at the ballot box to support initiatives that protect open space and parks, and to elect local leaders who support those things as well. At the statewide level, we have Great Outdoors Colorado, which has funded a great deal of land conservation and recreational infrastructure in our state. And it's funded by our state's lottery, which is going to require reauthorization at some point over the next few years. So that's going to be an opportunity for people to be involved at the state level. We're in the middle of our legislative session now. We're about a little over halfway through the Colorado legislature, and we haven't seen a lot of public lands related bills this year. I know a lot of folks that I interact with at the legislature, we're working on planning how to celebrate the first Colorado Public Lands Day on May 20th this year. So a great way to get involved would be to find a Colorado Public Lands Day event near you, and you can go to coloradopubliclands.org, but we can double check on that, and I can get back to it later, to find events to get involved near you. And finally, I would say for federal public lands, from time to time, there's definitely processes going on where they need public input, whether it be revising a forest plan for one of our national forests, or revising a resource management plan for BLM, or Bureau of Land Management lands. Right now in the 2nd Congressional District, the Eastern Colorado Resource Management Plan of the BLM is accepting public comments until early May on some preliminary alternatives that could shape the future of some of the public lands on the Front Range for the next generation. And these are places like, the Arkansas River Valley, and a lot of the public lands around Browns Canyon, and up and down the Front Range as well. So there's lots of ways for the public to be involved.
And Scott, before we go to Jim to answer this question too, that was asked by several people about what actions can citizens take and what should they do, I wanted to add another one to that you can address, because I think it might be one of these kind of it's not their own fault. They might have been reading some sort of false news account. But Heidi asked, does the Colorado Supreme Court ban on fracking extend to federal lands, or is it limited to towns and cities? So maybe you can address that there's not any kind of Supreme Court ban on that, and where that is, and address that fracking issue, but also the original issue of how people can be involved on this conservation side. Jim?
Yeah, so great question. Yeah, great question. Let me clarify that. So there is no ban on fracking right now. The Supreme Court, there was a case that came down last year. You may recall there was a lot of press over it, but the Supreme Court has held that fracking is permissible in Colorado. That's a short answer. It's complicated, more complicated very quickly. But at the Sierra Club, one way we believe that people can get involved in protecting public lands is by taking a friend outdoors and getting involved in an outdoors program or an outings program. In fact, the Sierra Club was founded by a man named John Muir 125 years ago, and he believed that the best way to persuade people to save wild areas and to preserve public lands was to actually take them into the wilderness. So I would encourage everybody to get involved with the countless organizations that are getting people outdoors and go beyond just going hiking on a weekend with a buddy, and get involved with an organization like Conservation Colorado or the Sierra Club. And I think you'll see there's a group of committed, passionate, smart, thoughtful people who want to do everything they can to protect Colorado and public lands for the future.
And we have a great question from Chris along those veins. We don't have panelists here that reflect the full diversity of our state or country. What steps are Sierra Club and Conservation Colorado taking, this is what Chris asks, to be able to diversify who speaks, plays, recreates on, and speaks for our public lands to reflect the full diversity of our country?
I could. So at the Sierra Club, we've recognized that unfortunately, many conservation groups are homogenous and overwhelmingly male. And at the core of all of our work is a program called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And at the Sierra Club, it's important to us that we are working along with everybody in America who wants to get outdoors, who cares about the environment, and making sure that both our membership and our volunteers, but more importantly, our leaders, look like the rest of America.
I think I would add to that we were observing among ourselves as we were waiting for this call to start, that same observation. So I'm not surprised it was noticed by our viewers. But at Conservation Colorado, we similarly care about this, but I think it's important to say that the reason that you care about diversity and inclusion, it matters on its own merits, but it also matters because if we want to win on the environment, it is critical that we are empowering and really getting all the voices possible who have conservation values as part of the public debate. And to the extent that we fail to do that, conservation issues will not prevail. So it is a necessity, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's also important for winning on our issues that we have all of our voices able to speak.
Great question.
And if I could just add to that question real fast, there's a group out of Golden that we work with, that OI works with, called Big City Mountaineers. And they were started up from within this industry, and their focus is really to take young, diverse people into the outdoors and show them how to camp, how to backpack, how to leave no trace. And they're really an excellent organization. I'd recommend that anybody who's interested to check them out and volunteer for them.
Thank you. And I want to welcome our new people on the call. We're up to almost 100 people, and I just want to welcome everybody. I'm Jared Polis. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the live chat window. Ivan has 2 comments. First, he wanted to let people know that High Plains Drifters will be doing a stream cleanup on public lands in May. But he also wanted to know what your ideas are for some non-consumptive uses of federal land, and how we can better have ideas to get non-consumptive uses like outside of parks. Anybody want to speak to that?
I would say, Representative Polis, the non-consumptive uses are by far and away the things that most Coloradans care about most with their public lands. And so there are millions of Coloradans who go out every weekend to hike, to fish, to hunt, to watch birds and whatnot. And one great example is your Continental Divide Wilderness and Recreation Act, which would make sure that some of our public lands are available permanently forever for those non-consumptive uses, and that wildlife has their habitat protected, that places where mountain bikers want to ride their mountain bikes are protected for that purpose. and they're not all mined and drilled for oil and gas. And so it's really the democratic part of our public lands that those non-consumptive users, which is the vast majority of Coloradans, have that access to their public lands, and that access is protected.
Diana mentioned, with the House having put the value in their rules at $0 of our public lands, is there anything we can do? I'll be happy to comment on that as well. But does anybody here been following the federal efforts and the offering and withdrawal of Mr. Chaffetz's bill, and kind of where those efforts are, and how they're they're valued at $0?
But OI has been tracking that pretty closely, as I imagine all the groups on the phone here on the video chat have been. And what strikes us is that Rob Bishop, Congressman Bishop, is the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee and should be one of the biggest proponents of, as the caller said, non-consumptive uses of the land, the recreation economy, and has instead treated the public lands policy with hostility, as evidenced by the lack of scoring the bill or valuing the public lands in legislation, but also even as recently as today saying they're going to introduce legislation to dilute or water down the Antiquities Act, which gives the president the power to protect some special places around the country when Congress is not able to act to protect those places. So that kind of positioning on public lands policy is really, really unfortunate at this point.
Thank you. And so just because they valued it at $0, it paves the way for a privatization of our public lands, but they still have to actually pass a bill to do that. So it sets the stage from a perspective of the rules of the House that they can pretend like this somehow doesn't cost the federal government any money. But there's still massive resistance to doing so. And that's why so many people are writing their representatives. It's why people should write their elected officials about the value of our public land, the jobs related to public land we need to highlight, because it's not a foregone conclusion. It simply gives them an advantage in terms of logistically looking like they somehow aren't costing taxpayers anything, and they don't have to pay for it. We're going to go back to Heidi's question, and I'll give a brief answer, and I think Jim will also. What Heidi wanted to ask is, she believed the court ruled that towns could not ban fracking. How does state law extend to federal lands within the state? This is a really complex legal area, Heidi. The Supreme Court ruled that some of these longer term moratoriums were struck down. They were more analogous to bans. Counties and cities still have extensive zoning authority under current law. Now, many of us, myself included, are strong supporters of additional specific authority for cities and counties. But if you want to look at what counties can do, look at what Boulder County just did in their new fracking regs, what other counties are considering doing as well. Now, how does it apply to federal land? And then I want to go to Jim on this. First of all, in the Front Range, we don't have a lot, hardly any fracking on federal land. It is mostly private land. However, in Western Colorado, we have mineral rights and surface rights that are owned by the federal government. When we are the landlord, that is, we the taxpayers, we the people, the federal government, we're able to have requirements above and beyond what might be in state law, if we choose, for extraction activities on federal lands. That's what I've been a strong supporter of. That's what the methane rule was an attempt to do. And Colorado has similar laws on the books for private land, but it would simply create a higher bar for regulating fracking that's done on federal land across the country. Jim, do you want to speak to this question of A, what happened with the Supreme Court ruling that struck down the moratoriums, and does state law extend to federal lands in the state?
Hey, yeah, I think you did a great job, Congressman, of explaining it, especially in relation to federal land. I think the key thing with the Supreme Court and where we are in Colorado is really trying to figure out what localities can do and what counties can do. So as the Congressman said, Boulder County is evaluating what to do. I'm sure if you've been paying attention to the news, there's been a lot going on in Broomfield, and there's sort of a gray area right now about what's permissible, what's not permissible, and what can local governments do to regulate and put in some safeguards around fracking. So I think in short, the Congressman really explained clearly that what's going on federal lands is pretty clear, is pretty cut and dry. Where we're really trying to figure out what can be done is at the local level. So I would encourage you to get involved with local government and reach out to your local leaders and ask them if you're concerned about fracking happening in your neighborhood to take action and pass something so that it won't.
I might also add that the BLM in 2015 issued a new regulation to do some common sense regulating of fracking on federal lands. And so it would do things like make sure that the well casings were safe, and it would regulate the waste pits so they wouldn't harm wildlife. So that rule was passed, and the Trump administration just issued a directive to the BLM to try and undo that. And so that's something to pay attention to. I think if you go to the Interior Department's website, you'll find there's no information on it. They've taken all that information down. But in the coming months, we would expect them to propose some changes in those regulations, and that would be another opportunity for the public to comment and talk about why common sense regulation on federal lands by the BLM is really important to Coloradans and their health and the outdoors.
Doug asked a question about soundscape protection, natural sounds and dark skies group. Would anybody like to comment on the importance of our public lands around natural sounds and dark skies?
So I'll take a swing at that. I think that dark skies and soundscapes are really important facets of public lands that many, many people in this country have little to no access to. I used to, in a previous career, be an instructor at the Colorado Outward Bound School, and we would bring people from all over the country out to experience public lands, a lot like the Big City Mountaineers group that Alex mentioned earlier. And it would be amazing. I would always be struck at, kids that have never seen the Milky Way before, who are just dumbstruck by what they're seeing. And so protected public lands create blocks of protected areas where you can get away from the sounds of development and where you can get away from light pollution and things like that. Some of our protected public lands, like Dinosaur National Monument in Northwest Colorado, are some of the best night skies and quietest places as measured in decibels in all of North America, or in the United States, the continental United States at least. So, to the extent we protect public lands, we are protecting those qualities as well.
Chris asked, what are my thoughts on moving the Bureau of Land Management from Washington, D.C. to the West? He said it's something that Senator Gardner has pushed for. I'd be happy to talk about that with Senator Gardner. I hadn't heard that particular proposal. Generally, as a representative of Colorado, if it means improving our jobs in Colorado or moving jobs to Colorado, I don't know why I wouldn't be for it. Fundamentally, though, I think it's a distraction from the issue of what is the charge of the Bureau of Land Management. Are they properly staffed? I think they could absolutely attract the same qualified level of employees in Colorado or Washington or Arizona or California. I don't think there's a question they could attract the workforce they need, but it's not going to change the work that they do if they're underfunded and their authority to protect our lands has been removed. Josh asked to talk more about our Continental Divide Bill, which I'm excited to do. Where exactly is this area, and why is it deserving of wilderness protection? I'll talk about my involvement with the process, and then I know Scott Braden has been intricately involved with this as well. We began a process, gosh, I think 6 years ago, Scott, 7 years ago, where we listened to a lot of stakeholders in Eagle and Summit County about what areas we wanted to place into perpetual conservation through wilderness level protections. Most of them are effectively being managed as wilderness areas today, but those are always subject to changes. So they include iconic areas along the Continental Divide. They include, for instance, 10 Mile, which is right near the town of Breckenridge, which all of the small businesses in Breckenridge want to make sure maintains its character as both an area for biking, which we have in our alternative management designation, as well as wilderness. And essentially, it's working with local stakeholders, small businesses, conservationists, hikers, biking community, about what the best use of our public land resources are, so that we can build, continue to rely upon those as our main economic driving force and main driver of our quality of life in Eagle and Summit County. And we arrived upon, well, we wanted to be even more bold and include hundreds of thousands of acres. We kind of eventually got it winnowed down to 40 or 50,000. Now it's a little bit bigger with the Campale expansion, around 70,000 acres, that we feel there is consensus locally that we want wilderness level protections for. Scott, do you want to address that? And I don't know if you have a map you can direct people to as well who want to learn more about the Continental Divide bill.
Yeah, Congressman, thank you. That was a great summary. And, that's absolutely right. I think what is important about the Continental Divide Recreation or Wilderness and Recreation Act is that proposal has been vetted by so many stakeholders and so many local stakeholders, as well as tremendous support on the Front Range as well. I think the other thing that's kind of a really interesting aspect to the Continental Divide proposal is that it would not only add to some of our existing really iconic wilderness areas like the Holy Cross Wilderness and the Eagle's Nest Wilderness, but it would also create some new protections, and some of them are pretty novel. So, Congressman, you mentioned the 10 mile outside of the towns of Breckenridge and Frisco. We'd really be able to create a tailoring and layering of protections, and that creates a corresponding layering of recreational opportunity in addition to protecting what is wild about the place. So you'd create a wilderness area in the wildest core of the 10-mile mountain range around Quandary Peak and to the north of that area, but then moving north and to the edges a little more where there are mountain bike trails and more recreational infrastructure to be able to create a recreation management area that creates a backcountry experience, but with a wider variety of recreational uses allowed, but in a way that still protects the land and protects the wildlife, all the way to the very front country experiences that one could have at the Breckenridge Ski Resort, which also shares the same mountain range. So I think we've been able to do some really unique and thoughtful approaches towards protecting public lands within that bill that I think make it distinctive. And I should also mention that in addition to Congressman Polis's great leadership over the years on this, that we expect this year for Senator Bennett to be introducing a companion in the United States Senate. And so we look forward to having a bill in both chambers of Congress. And while Congress looks really tough in a lot of ways for passing proactive, protective bills, I think bills like this that have a huge level of support in the community stand the best chance.
And I want to thank, again, the diverse aspects of the recreation community really came to the table on this bill. Not just hikers and cycling and wilderness advocates, but even the motorized community were able to work through all of those issues that people had with the bill to really build a strong consensus with that push. And as I tell those who are interested in the Continental Divide Wilderness and Recreation Bill, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. Whether it's another year or another 3 years or another 4 years, Congress will get it done. I remember when I first came to Congress in January of '09, there was an omnibus public lands bill. If you recall, that was the first time that the Democrats controlled the presidency, the House, 60 votes in the Senate. And there was a huge amount of wilderness included in that omnibus lands bill. This will be one of those things that's teed up for any type of omnibus bill that moves forward as soon as there's a pro-conservation majority, which there will be, and we just can't predict exactly when. So we're very excited to have been working on this bill. We hope to be able to expand it, as we mentioned, to include Campale and anything else we can do to build during this time as well. Did anybody else want to talk about wilderness and the Continental Divide bill?
Yeah, I just wanted to let folks know if they want to learn more about your proposal and the broad coalition of folks that are behind it, they can go to continentaldivide.org.
Thank you. So that's continentaldivide.org, and people can certainly let their elected officials know that they value the Continental Divide Wilderness Bill, their senators and their representatives. Obviously, if it's me, you don't need to. I wanted to go to, there's one more fracking question, and then we'll move on to another one. Jack asked, and maybe this is something you're familiar with too, it's outside of my district, Jim, but can you tell us anything about fracking near Bella Romero School in Greeley? He wants to know if it's another example of the powerful picking on the weak at a school with a heavy population of Latinos. And maybe you can also address a bill that's currently before our state legislature to increase offsets from schools.
Yeah, thanks, Congressman. That's a great question. The Sierra Club has actually been actively involved in this issue. Bella Romero is an elementary school in Greeley, and within several thousand feet of the school, the community is 95% Latino. It's a low-income community, and parents who send their children to that school are very concerned that a oil and gas company wants to frack within 1,000 feet of the school boundary. And the Sierra Club and a few other organizations actually have been canvassing and working in those neighborhoods. We also have some members there, and we're trying to build up public support. And I think it's going to result in a couple of actions, including a potential lawsuit to halt that operation from occurring, because we want to protect the health and safety of the students who go to Bella Romero. We want to protect the health and safety of the citizens in the surrounding community. So it's a really unfortunate situation what's occurring there. And in response to Bella Romero, well, partly in response to Bella Romero, but really in response to oil and gas development and fracking occurring within very close proximity to students and schools, Representative Mike Foote, who's in the Colorado legislature, has introduced a bill which would ensure that any oil and gas operations or fracking would occur with at least 1,000 feet from the perimeter of a school. That's different from the current Colorado statute. Currently, fracking cannot occur within 1,000 feet of a classroom. So think of a student sitting in a kindergarten classroom. That student then goes outside to play on the playground 500 feet away. Well, 500 feet from that student on a playground, if a oil and gas operation gets set up and frack away. So that bill that's being sponsored by Representative Mike Foote just passed the House. And it's now heading over to the state Senate.
Thank you, Jim. And I think you know that if there's any way you feel that I can be helpful there, I would be happy to. I've been very outspoken, and obviously the focus being the 2nd congressional district, but I'm always happy to try to intervene however I can to protect the health and welfare of kids and adults across our state. So certainly let us know if we can be of any help. There's 2 questions about climate change. Chris and Rob both act about, hey Rob, Rob's my Facebook buddy. Good to hear from you, Rob. Hey, Chris and Rob both asked about climate change and global warming. How is climate change affecting our public lands? How do we expect it to affect our public lands? And maybe somebody can also address the importance of healthy public lands in terms of carbon sequestration as well.
I just say climate change is having massive impacts already on our public lands, and you can look at what's happening with warming around our high elevation parks, losing snow cover, changing the vegetation, changing the wildlife movement patterns. And in the context of climate change, our public lands are incredibly important, especially for wildlife. When you think about wildlife having to move to adjust their habitat and migration patterns with a warming climate, the only places really they can do that is if there is a connected system of protected public lands. And if you've got just islands of habitat and no way to move among them, then we're going to lose a lot of our wildlife. And the same rules hold true for plants in our forests too. We're seeing that some of our forests are dying off because of climate change. Many Coloradans know about the bark beetles and the impact they have had on our forests. largely because of a warming climate that allows the bark beetles to, the populations to explode. So, climate change in our public lands is really important, and it's imperative that we also manage our public lands so we're not exacerbating climate change. That's where, as I think Jim was talking about earlier, the methane capture rules that are under attack in the U.S. Senate right now are really important.
Could I also just add that in Colorado, in addition to the beetle kill, which, climate change is driving forest change, right? And the beetle kill is an incredibly visual reminder of that. But I think it's also really important to point out that, the increased dryness is going to lead to, more wildfires and longer wildfire seasons, driven by increased drought, as well as in a state like Colorado, rather than having giant reservoirs with all our water supply in it, our mountains and our snow are our water supply. There's 30 million people who depend on the water within, or maybe 20 to 30 million people, I don't remember the exact number, but millions and millions of people depend on the water in the Colorado River system. Millions of people on the Front Range of Colorado do as well. Climate change is threatening that water supply.
Scott, I'll jump off from right there if I can, because it's a great point about wildfire, and obviously the outdoor industry is dependent on a stable climate, and the seasons have just, the weather in the seasons has been so unstable, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years. But the point about kind of excessive drought and this wildfire issue, not only is it devastating for the kind of apparent reasons, the impact on the natural world itself, the impact on the recreational experience, and the impact on the environment. But if you look at it from a policy standpoint, there's also this concept going on in the Forest Service of what's called fire borrowing, which means that the budgets that go out to other aspects of forest management, when there are these devastating forest fires, they have to transfer money out of the recreation and management budgets over into firefighting costs. So as these fires get much bigger and much more devastating, and they have to spend more money to fight them, there's less money for recreation and conservation management.
And Alex, I want to go back to you with this question. Elizabeth asks, how do we shift the rhetoric from economic benefits of fossil fuel and mining and extraction towards the economic benefits of the outdoor industry and recreation, kind of a more sustainable economic model with better, longer lasting jobs, healthier populations? How do we shift that rhetoric?
That's a great question, and OIA and many other groups are in the process of doing that now, hopefully. You see legislation that passed unanimously with bipartisan support in the Congress last year called the Outdoor Recreation Jobs and Economic Impact Act, or the REC Act, which directs the Department of Commerce to actually do a study similar to the Outdoor Industry Association study to measure the economic benefits. And one thing, we talk about this concept of healthy communities and healthy economies, that when policymakers invest back in an outdoor recreation, they get a massive return on investment for that spending. But what I have found is it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to come in armed with data. So I'd say when you're going to those town halls, either with your members of Congress or you're going to the local elected officials, is to arm yourself with some of that data. You can find it at Outdoor Industry Association at outdoorindustry.org, or you can go to the Department of the Interior. They've done some really, really great studies on economic benefit. Really what's gaining traction there is data driven arguments there, because theoretical or anecdotal appeals to some but not all. But we have found in particular that some folks who may not traditionally support recreational use of public lands or even conservation and stewardship, or maybe aren't aware of it, when they start seeing what is going on in their state, the economic activity in their state, their eyes are truly opened.
And while we're talking about data, I just want to put a plug in real quick for a study that Pew commissioned recently on the value of quiet recreation. That's recreation that doesn't involve motor vehicles beyond transportation to the recreation site. We did that study on the 246 million acres of land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And the study found that quiet recreation supports 25,000 jobs and generates $2.8 billion with a B, dollars for the US economy. And in Colorado alone, that's 3,400 jobs and $275 million in spending annually within 50 miles of these public lands. So I think the question was, how do we change that narrative? I'll just highlight that you've heard the phrase that all politics is local. They're genuinely interested in what their constituents have to say. And if they know that those constituents are members of a large, easily mobilized group, like, say, a conservation advocacy group, they're going to pay a lot of attention.
And that's a good transition. I'm very interested in what those of you listening have to say. If you're my constituents, I have town halls coming up in Estes Park, Nederland, Loveland, and Boulder. We recently held them in Fort Collins and Broomfield. We also have one in Lyons coming up. We'll be in our mountain communities in May. That schedule will be announced shortly. Those cities I just mentioned, we have physical in-person town halls with me coming up in the next couple weeks. I have a couple of questions I'm going to read, and then I want to go to each of our panelists for a 1-minute closing, if that works. And you can address some or all of these questions in your closing remarks. Jennifer asked about the North Fork Valley and the fracking battle there, if they have any ideas about their voices heard. Chris asked me, which I'll answer, what are my thoughts on reintroducing wolves back into Rocky Mountain National Park? I've been a strong supporter of that, continue to be. Janet asked, how do citizens who are committed to public lands prioritize our time and energy now with so much going on with Congress and the administration and external forces? Diana asked if climate change has added to algae in our lakes. And Susan asked which local and national groups should we look at that are doing work in this area. And finally, Heidi wanted to highlight the Seattle effort around trails and bike paths, connecting one green space to another, wildlife corridors, if you will, that are extremely important from an ecological perspective. So we're going to go to each of you for one final minute. I want to thank the well over 100 of you who joined our call at some point during our session. I want to also mention that this is our third of these Google Hangouts. And frankly, we want your ideas and suggestions about what we can do better. So type them in the live chat. We're always looking for suggestions for future topics, for ways that we can better serve my constituents. Scott Braden, final remarks.
All right. Well, Congressman, thanks for having us tonight. It's been an honor to be on this panel, and thanks to my co-panelists. This has been wonderful. I think in Colorado, we have an amazing bounty of public lands. Those 24 million acres inspire us. I mean, for goodness sakes, it's on our license plate. It's in the DNA of our identity as Coloradans. You know, and I think we can be proud of what we've done to take care of these places, not just with the land protection designations. You know, we can rattle off the acres of wilderness that we've protected and, you know, the things that we're doing there. But we've also been a leader on climate and trying to get our arms around protecting water supplies and just making sure that for the future, we are going to have what we have now moving forward. And I think if you're looking to get involved, again, Colorado Public Lands Day is May 20th. The first holiday is coming up. You can go to copubliclandsday.com to find an event near you and to get plugged into that holiday. If you were looking to get more involved in an advocacy role, you can get involved with Conservation Colorado. My organization works on clean air, water, and public lands and climate in the state of Colorado, and then electing pro-conservation leaders and holding them accountable. So we're at conservationco.org.
Anders?
Thanks.
Anders?
There's a lot of talk on the call about staying vigilant, and that's important given all the threats we're seeing. But real quickly, I just wanted to say, since the beginning of the 115th Congress in January, we've seen 6 bills introduced in the House and 9 bills introduced in the Senate that would protect public lands in Arizona, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. If passed, those bills would permanently protect almost 1 million acres of wilderness, 1.7 million acres as national monument land, over 250,000 acres through other protected conservation designations, and over 500 miles of wild scenic rivers. And there's even more to come in places like Tennessee and Virginia and Idaho. So groups are playing a lot of defense now, and it's vitally important they continue that work. But proactive wilderness legislation is important too. Legislation is a muscle, and if we don't use it, it'll atrophy. So I encourage everybody to get involved.
Thank you, Jim. Anders?
Hey, Representative Polis, thank you and the panelists for making public lands a priority and supporting our Western heritage. For 125 years, the Sierra Club has helped everyone explore, enjoy, and protect our public lands. And we truly believe that they're held in public trust. And it's important for us to not forget that the concept of public lands is an original American idea. Yellowstone was the world's first national park. And in Colorado, as our population increases, as more development occurs, Coloradans will come to increasingly value and protect these public lands, open spaces, and wilderness. So please stay involved. Get involved with the Sierra Club, get involved with Conservation Colorado, and get involved with any of the other numerous groups that exist in the state.
Anybody else closing thoughts?
This is Alex at Outdoor Industry Association. I did just want to thank the other panelists and everyone for attending, and thank you, Representative Polis, for the invitation to join you today. This really has been a great experience and a great conversation. And I want to just do a plug. The Congressman received Outdoor Industry Association's 2015 Friend of the Outdoor Industry Award for everything that he's done to protect public lands in Colorado and across the country. So thank you for that as well. And just to echo Jim's point from the story about John Muir about getting people out. So I know that talking to federal policymakers can sometimes be daunting or overwhelming or time consuming. And to the question about how do we prioritize our time, somebody mentioned all politics is local. And I think going to talk to your city council members, it's a very easy Google search to figure out who represents you at city council, who represents you in state government. But also when you find out who your member of Congress is, you can call their district offices. You don't necessarily have to call them in Washington, D.C. Congressman Polis hosts town halls. They all host town halls. And I think this year in particular, we've really seen the efficacy of people's involvement in it. You see Congressman Chaffetz, and then just over the weekend, Congressman Stewart there in Utah. They have overwhelming overflow crowds coming in to talk to them in part about protecting public lands. And it's getting into the national news media. It's clearly hitting their radar screens, and I think creating that kind of surround sound around some of these folks who are maybe a little bit antagonistic towards protecting these public lands. But lastly, I just say continue to go outside and take somebody with you, because the point about John Muir getting them out into the outdoors, into the wilderness, to help them understand why these places need to be protected. So when you go on a hike, somebody who may not be with you, who may not get outdoors as much.
Thank you, Alex. I think Scott Miller, do you have anything to add?
Just thank you very much, and I would echo that there are lots of attacks underway in Washington, D.C., and it's really important for folks to get involved. Pick a couple issues, talk to your friends, and call your congressman, call your senators, call your local federal land managers, because wilderness is something that can be protected but not recreated, and I think the same goes for all of our public lands. If we lose them, we will not get them back.
Thank you, Scott. That's very eloquent. The wilderness is forever. And I want to thank everybody for participating in this very robust discussion, our panelists, the people who asked questions, the well over 100 people who watched our presentation here tonight. I'm very much looking forward to reintroducing our Continental Divide Wilderness and Recreation Act shortly. As I say, it's a matter of when, not if. It will become law. We will protect those lands. I plan on continuing to fight to defend our public lands against any and all attacks. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today for helping to learn the tools that we need to be advocates, and learning from our terrific panelists that we had today about the benefits of protecting our public land. Once again, I'm Jared Polis. You can follow me on Facebook, on Twitter, Rep. Jared Polis, on YouTube, and polis.house.gov is the website. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for a terrific discussion, to the people who joined us, and to everybody. I want you to all have a terrific evening. Take care.
Thank you.